The morning it all began. The silence of pre-dawn Gdańsk was so thick that it seemed as if nature itself had held its breath. Nothing foreshadowed that in a few minutes an event would begin that would change the fate of millions of people. On the Westerplatte Peninsula, a small strip of land where a Polish military warehouse was located, sentries slowly patrolled their positions. Everything looked normal, almost mundane. A light breeze rustled the tops of the pine trees, and if it weren't for the tense situation of the past few weeks, one might have thought it was just another summer morning. But this morning was different. It was the last morning for the old world. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein was anchored in the roadstead. Officially, it was on a friendly visit. In reality, it was an old but still formidable ship, prepared for war, whose guns were aimed directly at the Polish fortifications. Polish soldiers were used to seeing it in the harbor and knew that Berlin's statements could not be trusted. Tension hung in the air, but no one knew the exact moment when it would turn into a real catastrophe. At 4:47 a.m., the silence was broken by the first volley. The earth shook, flames burst from the battleship's barrels, and in the same second, a column of smoke rose above Westerplatte. Polish sentries rushed to the fortifications, some grabbed their rifles, others crossed themselves, unable to believe that it had really begun. The first seconds of war are always the most terrifying. They mix fear, confusion, rage, and the realization that there is no turning back. German shells exploded one after another. The fire was accurate and methodical, as if someone were coldly drawing lines of destruction. Buildings caught fire, walls crumbled, windows exploded with shrapnel. But amid all this chaos, the Polish defenders did not flee or surrender. They took up positions, prepared to defend themselves, and began to act as if the fate of the entire country was being decided on this tiny piece of land. The command on the battleship was confident that the resistance would be broken in a matter of minutes. The Polish garrison consisted of only about 200 men, with almost no heavy weapons and limited ammunition. The Germans expected a quick and easy victory, but they were wrong. The first minutes of the defense of Westerplatte became a symbol of how even a small group of people can challenge a huge military machine. The Polish soldiers, poorly armed and surrounded, but united by a single thought not to retreat, held their positions, firing at the landing force, sheltering the wounded, passing ammunition and orders to each other. Every second seemed like an eternity. Every flash could be the last. But amid the smoke, fire, and noise, something emerged that could not be destroyed by artillery. Steadfastness. Determination. A willingness to hold on, no matter what. This small garrison did not save Poland from occupation. It could not stop the German army. But it became the first line of defense, where the world saw that the Wehrmacht's attack was not a Blitzkrieg. It was war. Real, cruel, merciless. And it began here, amid the flames and smoke of Westerplatte. The morning of the 1st of September, 1939, will forever remain the moment when history took a sharp, terrible turn. It was here, on this tiny strip of land, that the first shots were fired, signaling the beginning of the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, World War II. While fierce fighting continued at Westerplatte, an operation was already unfolding across the Polish border, the scale of which no one in the world could have imagined. On the 1st of September 1939, at around 5 in the morning, German troops crossed the border simultaneously at dozens of points. Everything was calculated down to the minute, down to the second. The first fully planned Blitzkrieg operation in history began. The engines of German bombers roared in the sky. They flew in tight formations, like metal flocks, confident in their absolute power. The Luftwaffe received orders to destroy Polish airfields before Polish planes could take off. In the first few hours, Most Polish air bases were hit. Aircraft standing on the ground in neat rows were turned into burning wreckage. Pilots, still sleepy, ran out of the barracks and saw their only weapon, the Air Force, disappear in a rain of fire. Half of the Polish Air Force was put out of action in the first hours of the war. At the same time, huge mechanized columns of the Wehrmacht were moving on the ground. WWII and A-2 tanks, light but fast, were accompanied by armored vehicles, motorcyclists, and artillery. The columns stretched for kilometers, raising clouds of dust on the narrow Polish roads. German officers noted in their logs, "Resistance is weak, progress is good." But in fact, and there was resistance. It's just that the Polish army was forced to respond to an attack that came from too many directions at once. Polish troops, stretched across a vast border, were unable to organize a united front. Small, heroic but scattered battles took place at various points. Cavalry attempted to counterattack mechanized units. Artillerymen deployed directly on the roads, trying to stop tanks with volleys from old cannons. In some places, Polish units managed to delay the German advance, but only for half an hour, 2 hours. The forces were too unequal. In towns and villages, people woke up to the roar of bombing. Peaceful life was destroyed in an instant. Some ran out into the streets, trying to understand how close the front line was. Others rushed to the basements, taking their children with them. Radio receivers crackled with government announcements. "Citizens, Germany has attacked. War has begun." But even the words sounded quiet against the backdrop of the real roar that filled the air. In the first hours of the invasion, the Germans used everything that was to become the hallmark of the Blitzkrieg: speed, surprise, coordination. Tanks broke through the defenses, aircraft destroyed infrastructure, and motorized units bypassed strongholds to surround them from the rear. Polish generals, trying to organize the front, faced the same problem. Communications were interrupted, roads were destroyed, and troops did not have time to reach their positions. Despite this, the Polish army did not retreat in panic. Many units held their positions longer than the enemy expected. In some places, the battle was fought for every hill, every village, every bridge. Crowds of refugees mingled with military columns, but no one surrendered without a fight. The first deep wound appeared on the face of Europe, and it continued to widen. By noon on September 1, the German command reported significant successes. But beneath this cold, mechanical optimism lay the truth. Polish soldiers were fighting stubbornly, and in some places even desperately. They understood that this was not just another conflict. It was a battle for the very life of their country. And while the defenders continued to hold out at Westerplatte, a tragic mosaic of the first hours of World War II was already taking shape throughout Poland. Chaos, explosions, fire, columns of troops, resistance, and fear. The world had entered a new era, and no one on the continent could yet imagine how devastating it would be. While a lightning campaign unfolded at Westerplatte and across Poland's western border, history had a new, even more difficult test in store. The German Blitzkrieg broke through the defenses, crushed divisions, and destroyed bridges. And then, like a shadow following a shadow, a strike from the east followed on September 17, 1939. The Red Army crossed the Polish border. This day did not come out of nowhere. Long before the shots were fired and the tanks rolled in, diplomatic treaties and secret protocols had already sealed the fate of countries. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact turned the map of Europe into a black-and-white division scheme. Zones of influence, lines of contact, political borders that ordinary people did not know about, but which determined who would come to their villages and towns, and whose boots would pound the pavements. When Red Army units moved into eastern Poland, it came as a shock and a betrayal to many. Already depleted and torn apart by fighting, the Polish army could not hold off attacks from two sides at once. In some areas, the last local battles took place. Soldiers, tired and exhausted, tried to organize a defense. In others, commanders received orders to abandon their positions to avoid encirclement. Streams of refugees appeared on the roads, women, children, and the elderly, seeking shelter from the shelling and occupation that was coming from two directions. In Brest-Litovsk, a city at the crossroads, a symbolic but eerily telling episode soon took place. German and Soviet troops met, exchanged trophies, and organized a joint passage of troops, a parade that for many became evidence of the cruel reality. The agreements between the regimes meant the division of a foreign country. This parade of allies was a rare and disturbing phenomenon. It did not speak of friendship between peoples, but rather of the implementation of pre-agreed maps and lines on paper. The documents and maps signed in Berlin and Moscow cemented the division. They were cold schemes. Spheres of influence, administrative borders, occupation routes. For historians, these papers became the key to understanding the causes of the catastrophe. Not only military power, but also secret diplomacy, betrayal, and calculation. For the people on the ground, it meant the loss of sovereignty, the division of families, and the beginning of a new occupation administration that came with its own policies, its own language, and its own repressions. In some regions, Polish units tried to resist both Soviet aggression and the German offensive at the same time. But the numerical and resource superiority of their opponents was overwhelming. Many sections of the front ceased to be a front in the classical sense. They became arteries of flight, crowded with carts, half-destroyed bridges, and frightened citizens. City after city changed. New marks appeared in administrative documents. Dotted lines appeared on maps that did not exist yesterday. By the end of September, Poland was divided. Some parts were under the control of the Wehrmacht, others under the control of the Red Army. The new borders established on paper proved to be cruel and real. Families were separated. Cultural centers found themselves under different jurisdictions, and political repression and forced displacement began almost immediately. These events are not just a page in military history. They are a lesson in how diplomacy behind the scenes can determine the fate of millions, how maps and signatures on paper can become instruments of incredible power. When we look at the map of 1939, we see dotted lines and lines, but behind them are human destinies, families, cities, entire regions that found themselves at the crossroads of imperial interests. So, while the West faced the Wehrmacht's lightning-fast mechanical strike, the East suddenly opened up a new dimension of tragedy. Poland, caught between two armies, became the first major victim of the agreements and wars that would change the face of Europe forever. After the rapid collapse of Poland, Europe suddenly froze. The war had begun, but it was as if no one wanted to fight it. This gave rise to what would later be called the Strange War, a period when armies stood facing each other but hardly fired a shot. On the Western Front, thousands of French and British soldiers took up positions along the German border. They looked at the equally immobile lines of the Wehrmacht, which stretched along the fortified Siegfried Line. Sometimes the sides exchanged not bullets, but leaflets. Soldiers joked, "We are at war, but without war." But this silence was deceptive. Germany and the USSR were only preparing for new steps. France believed in its indestructible fortress, the Maginot Line. It was an entire underground world of concrete fortifications, artillery blocks, tunnels, and barracks. The French assured themselves that this line could hold off any German army. But there was one caveat. It did not cover the border with Belgium, and this gap would later prove fatal. Meanwhile, Britain was sending its first divisions to France, the British Expeditionary Force. Young soldiers, who had never seen combat, played soccer against the backdrop of fortifications, drank tea in the trenches, and wrote letters home. Many felt that real battles were still a long way off. Germany, however, used this lull with frightening efficiency. Factories were being set up, submarines were being built, and new bomber squadrons were being trained. Berlin was preparing not just for defense, but for an attack. This strike was to take place in the north. Hitler desperately needed Scandinavian resources, iron ore, nickel, and timber. Swedish iron ore, which was transported through the Norwegian port of Narvik in winter, was particularly important. If Britain blocked this route, German industry would be threatened, and Hitler decided to act first. While Germany was preparing to invade Norway and Denmark, another giant, the USSR, began its own campaign. In the fall of 1939, the Soviet Union demanded that Finland change its border, moving it away from Leningrad. Finland refused. On November 30, the Winter War began. The Red Army was confident of an easy victory. But the Finns responded with astonishing ferocity. White ghosts on skis, small mobile groups, deadly accurate marksmen, and endless frosts all turned into a nightmare for the Soviet troops. The Mannerheim Line showed remarkable resilience, holding back the vastly superior Soviet forces. Although the USSR ultimately won, the world saw a shocking truth. The Eastern Giant, frightening in its power, actually suffered from poor training, poor communications, and chaos in its command structure. And so, the beginning of 1940. Germany is building up its power. France is relying on concrete. Britain is preparing its fleet. The USSR is healing the wounds of the Winter War. The United States watches from afar, not yet realizing that war will find them too. Europe seems to be holding its breath, but this silence is the calm before the storm. Very soon, the world will see a blow that will turn the tide of World War II. In the spring of 1940, the world awoke once again from relative calm, and this time, the blow came from the north. On April 9, Nazi Germany launched Operation Weserübung, a secret operation involving a lightning-fast invasion of Norway and Denmark. For many contemporaries, this move seemed unexpected, but it was based on cold strategic calculations: control of sea lanes, access to Swedish iron ore, and the desire to secure vital supplies of resources that fueled German industry. Denmark was an easier target. Within hours, the kingdom was occupied. The Allied defense did not have time to deploy. German paratroopers and Wehrmacht units occupied key ports, airfields, and administrative centers. The monarchy and the government capitulated, seeking to avoid unnecessary destruction. It was a quick, cold operation. The small state found itself in the grip of a new reality. Norway, however, became the arena for a much more complex and dramatic campaign. German troops landed in Oslo, Trondheim, Bergen, and Narvik. The strategic port of Narvik, a key point for the export of Swedish ore, became the center of particularly fierce fighting. Upon learning of the German operations, the British Navy immediately joined the fight. Corvettes, cruisers, squadrons, and Allied ground forces headed for Norway to thwart the capture of ports and intercept convoys. One of the most dramatic moments was the attempt to capture Oslo. At the entrance to the Oslo fjord, the German cruiser Blücher launched an assault, but was hit by artillery and torpedoes from the Oscarsborg fortress. The ship burned and sank, giving the Norwegian government and the royal family precious time. They managed to evacuate and preserve their legitimacy. This act of defense became a symbol that resistance is possible even against a powerful machine. The fighting took place in snow and rain, in the mountains, and in narrow fjords. In Narvik, there were heavy clashes between German mountain troops and Allied forces, including British and French units, supported by Norwegian volunteers. The naval battles off the coast were bloody. Ships were destroyed, decks were covered with ice and blood, and the sea was an impassive witness to human cruelty. After a series of attacks and counterattacks, Narvik became a symbol of the Allies' temporary victory. They even managed to recapture the port. But holding it in the long term proved extremely difficult. Politics came into play. Norwegian leader Quisling marched to power with German support, proclaiming a collaborationist government. But an underground movement was growing throughout the country. Partisans, peasant militias, and officers did not accept the occupation without a fight. Popular uprisings, sabotage of communication lines, and sabotage helped to buy time and prevented the Germans from gaining a foothold. For Germany, the operation had mixed results. Strategic goals, control over ore, supplies, and new ports were partially achieved, but at the cost of extensive logistics and sudden fighting. For the Allies, it was a hard lesson in planning expeditionary operations, but also a moment of remarkable courage for the Navy and troops who tried to resist the sudden onslaught. Operation Weserübung showed two things. First, that the war was no longer a local conflict. It now encompassed the entire continent and neighboring seas. Second, that even in conditions of relative calm, the enemies were preparing lightning strikes where they were least expected. For several months, Scandinavia became an arena of strategic rivalry, where the fate of ports and mines was decided by the force of cannons, the cunning of landing parties, and the courage of those who stood up to defend their land. May 1940. Europe is frozen in anxious anticipation. After the fall of Poland, everyone understood that Germany's next strike was inevitable. But no one, neither the military, nor analysts, nor even the French generals themselves, could have imagined that the fatal breach would occur where no one expected it. Even in their wildest nightmares, in the dense, gloomy forests of the Ardennes, France was confident in its defenses. On the eastern border, like a giant steel snake, stretched the Maginot Line, the most powerful fortification system of its time. Concrete casemates, guns, underground complexes, automatic armored turrets, all this seemed like an impenetrable shield. However, there was one weakness. The French command considered the Ardennes impassable for tanks, and it was there that Hitler planned to deliver his main blow. On the 10th of May, 1940, the silence of the Ardennes forests was broken by a terrible roar. Thousands of German tanks, artillery, and motorized columns rushed forward along narrow roads, which the French believed were impossible to pass on the necessary scale. But the German Blitzkrieg strategy proved otherwise. The Wehrmacht columns moved continuously, day and night. Traffic jams stretched for tens of kilometers, but the war machine did not stop for a minute. French intelligence sent alarming reports. German tanks in the Ardennes. But headquarters dismisses it. That's impossible. While the generals argue, German troops are already breaking through to the Meuse River, the key point of the entire operation. On May 13, near the city of Sedan, what would later be called the moment of truth begins. The Germans concentrated unprecedented air power on this section. Bombers dove on French positions again and again, turning the fortifications into chaos. In a matter of hours, the defenses, which had been considered strong, collapsed under the blows of the Stukas, the infamous dive bombers. And following the Air Force came the tanks. The panzers forced the Meuse, set up crossings, and rapidly broke through the French line. One section, just one. But it was this section that became the fatal cut that split the entire French defense in two. Panic grows. French units retreat without communication or coordination, under pressure from the rapid maneuvers of German tank divisions. The Ghost of Sedan is what the psychological shock that gripped the troops would later be called. The breakthrough spreads like an avalanche. German tanks, like steel arrows, rush towards the English Channel to surround a huge group of allies. This moment, the breakthrough through the Ardennes, would become one of the most crucial in the history of World War II. It was a blow from which France would never recover, and it was the beginning of a catastrophe that would lead to the miracle of salvation off the coast of Dunkirk. But that is the next scene, Dunkirk. A small French port city known only to sailors, fishermen, and locals in the spring of 1940. But in just a few weeks, the fate of all of Europe will be decided here. Here, on the cold beaches of the English Channel, despair, chaos, hope, and incredible courage will converge. After the Wehrmacht's devastating breakthrough through the Ardennes, the Allied forces found themselves cut off and surrounded. The British Expeditionary Force, parts of the French Army, and Belgian units were caught in a huge cauldron, a trap stretching along the coast, which the Germans were rapidly closing in on. There was only one way out the sea. The evacuation operation was named Dynamo. But at the beginning, no one believed it would succeed. British Army generals expected to evacuate a maximum of 40,000 soldiers, but there were more than 300,000 on the coast. And all this, under the blows of German aviation, continuous artillery fire, and the rapidly advancing tank wedges of Guderian. Soldiers left without equipment, supplies, or communications moved toward Dunkirk on foot, in columns, making their way through burning cities and ruined roads. Many carried the wounded on improvised stretchers. No one thought about victory anymore. It was only about survival. The beaches of Dunkirk themselves resembled an apocalypse. Thousands of soldiers stood in lines hundreds of meters long, waiting their turn to board, under the open sky, without shelter. The sand was littered with abandoned equipment, overturned trucks, burned tanks, and the remains of the destroyed port. German Ju-87 aircraft dove onto the beaches again and again, leaving behind bomb craters and smoking bodies. But then a miracle began. When it became clear that the army could be destroyed in the cauldron, thousands of ordinary British people responded to the Royal Navy's call. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, small yachts, tugs, sailing ships, hundreds of little ships set out into the English Channel. Their owners, many of whom had never seen war, headed into the fire to rescue soldiers. Large ships could not approach the shallow waters, and it was these small vessels that became a bridge of life. They plowed through the sea, maneuvering between bomb craters, rescuing the wounded, picking people up from the water, transferring them to large ships, and returning again and again. In 9 days, from May 26 to June 4, 338,226 people were evacuated, a number that no one thought possible even in their wildest dreams. It was a rescue that went down in history as the miracle of Dunkirk. However, it could not be called a victory. The Allies lost almost all their equipment, left France on the brink of destruction, and lost the strategic initiative. But they saved the most important thing, people, and these people would later return to continue the fight. Dunkirk became a symbol not of defeat, but of resilience. A symbol that even when everything is falling apart, when the enemy surrounds you on all sides, when hope seems impossible, people still find the strength to fight for their lives. And this evacuation would determine the entire course of the war. On the 4th of June, 1940, the evacuation of Dunkirk was completed. Only ashes remained on the beaches, burnt-out equipment, a destroyed city, shipwrecks, and the bodies of the dead. But at the same time, Europe understood that the main battle was still ahead. France, the country with the largest army on the continent, stood almost alone in the way of the Wehrmacht. The German troops had no intention of stopping. After Dunkirk, Hitler directed his forces south and west to finally break the resistance. On June 5, a new phase of the offensive began Operation Rot. Tank divisions rapidly advanced towards Paris, bypassing defensive positions, crushing resistance, and leaving columns of prisoners in their wake. The French army was exhausted. Fatigue, lack of equipment, loss of communication, and demoralization made defense impossible. Generals, who had grown up on the experience of World War I, again tried to hold the front with static lines, while the Wehrmacht moved lightning fast, striking in the most unexpected directions. Cities fell one after another. Reims, Amiens, Rouen, all of them came under the control of German units. Entire columns of civilian refugees appeared. Millions of people left their homes, fleeing south, crowding onto already congested roads. Bridges were blown up to delay the advance of tanks, but this only slowed the offensive for a few minutes. At the same time, a political catastrophe was brewing within France itself. There were disputes within the government over whether to continue fighting or seek an armistice. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud wanted to resist, but Marshal Pétain, a hero of the First World War, insisted, "We must stop the slaughter." The public, shocked by the collapse of the front, was inclined to agree with him. On the 14th of June 1940, Paris was declared an open city to avoid destruction. French troops left the capital. By morning, German motorcyclists and tanks had entered the city without firing a single shot. The streets were silent. Residents watched from their windows as Wehrmacht soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées, like a shadow of a new era looming over Europe. On June 17, Marshal Pétain announced his intention to sign an armistice. Millions of French people listened to his speech on the radio. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you that we must stop fighting." It was a moral blow that made it clear that the country, which had stood for centuries, could no longer continue the war. On the 22nd of June 1940, in the very same train car near Compiègne, where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, France now signed its defeat. Hitler ordered that this particular train car be used as symbolic humiliation, revenge for past grievances. After the signing, he ordered it to be taken to Germany and the memorial site to be destroyed. France was divided into two parts. The north and west of the country were under direct German occupation. The south became a formally independent state, the Vichy regime, led by Marshal Pétain, but effectively controlled by Berlin. German patrols appeared on the streets of Paris, along with signs in German and portraits of Hitler. Arrests, restrictions, and curfews began. The occupation brought fear, hunger, and tension, but it also marked the beginning of resistance. Already in the first weeks, underground groups appeared, along with the first leaflets and the first acts of sabotage. France did not give up. Long years of struggle lay ahead, but for now it was 1940. Europe was under the rule of the Third Reich. Britain stood alone against Germany, and France, one of the world's greatest powers, found itself under a foreign flag for the first time in 2 centuries. Paris is a city of art, freedom, and light. But in the summer of 1940, this city was plunged into darkness, silence, and fear. The Wehrmacht's advance was so rapid that it seemed as if the whole of France was collapsing in one swift breath. After the failure of the defense at the Somme and the collapse of communications, the French army retreated rapidly. Chaos reigned on the roads. Hundreds of thousands of refugees, family after family, dragged suitcases, carts, and baby carriages, trying to get as far away as possible from the approaching war. Realizing that it was impossible to hold the capital, the French government made a difficult decision. Paris was declared an open city. This meant that troops would not defend it in order to avoid destruction and mass casualties among the civilian population. In order to preserve the architecture, history, and spirit of Paris, the capital was effectively abandoned. On the morning of the 14th of June 1940, German troops entered Paris without a single shot. Without a fight, the Wehrmacht moved through the deserted streets, along the majestic Seine, to the rustle of swastika flags that German soldiers unfurled over government buildings. Nazi symbols appeared on the Eiffel Tower, which symbolized French pride and independence. Witnesses recalled that the silence was almost unbearable. Paris, which had never known silence, suddenly resembled a museum closed forever. Chronicles of that day showed German motorcycles and tanks slowly moving along the Arc de Triomphe. Soldiers smile at the cameras and write postcards home. "We are in France. We are in Paris." Meanwhile, the French government fled south to Bordeaux. The country was broken, demoralized, divided, and soon, on June 22, it signed an armistice, one of the most difficult in its history. For Europe, the fall of Paris came as a shock. The capital, which for centuries had been considered the spiritual center of the continent, was now under German control. The French said, "We survived 1,871. We survived 1,914. But what has happened now is a wound that will not heal for a long time." Paris was not destroyed by artillery, but it was destroyed morally. Residents who took to the streets after the Germans entered avoided looking German soldiers in the eye. France was divided into two worlds: the north, which was occupied, and the south, which was formally under the free regime of Vichy, but in reality dependent on Germany. From that moment on, Paris began a new life, a life under occupation. Endurance, resistance, and hope were still ahead. But in June 1940, the city was gripped by a single feeling, an abyss of defeat that seemed unbearable even for a country with such a history. Translated with deepl.com. Free version.